First, I really want to welcome you all and thank you for being with us on the 3rd of May, which in our part of the world is a holiday. And Ruzha and me, we basically chose probably not the best date for such a day to talk about something which is of great importance, I would say, for the whole region. And now we're going to hear the example from Bulgaria. Last autumn, when I was searching for some kind of stories about anti-gender relating to Orthodox countries, the first text and then a very instructive text that I found was, in fact, Ruzha Smilova, which was about the turn against genders in Bulgarian constitutional discourse. I remember I was very surprised by that kind of discursive strategy, which of course is not anything specifically Bulgarian. We find it in other countries as well, but that was not used, for example, in Serbia, and that is going to be very interesting later on in the discussion, is absolutely a part of the discussion today, when we also have a major discussion about the introduction of laws on same-sex partnership and on gender equality. So gender also appears as something unconstitutional. In that sense, this talk of today would be very, very important for understanding the situation as it is happening right now in Serbia. But I would also think that this would be interesting in itself in general. So Ruzha Smilova is going to talk about illiberal constitutionalism with a question mark, about the turn against genders, and genders again under quotation marks, in Bulgarian constitutional discourse. Let me say just a couple of words about Ruzha Smilova. She teaches contemporary political philosophy and history of political ideas at the Department of Political Science at the University of Sofia. She is also the program director for political research at the Center for Liberal Strategies, and her last publication, The Ideological Turn in Bulgarian Constitutional Discourse, The Rise Against Genders, has been published in Critical Essays on Human Rights Criticism in 2020. Research on this presentation is supported by the European Commission within the framework of Horizon 2020 project, Populism and Civic Engagement. The idea is that Ruzha presents, and then we will open the floor for discussion. Ruzha, the floor is yours. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for this opportunity to present on a topic that still excites me, and also to post some points of discussion on a concept that is vigorously debated now, the concept of illiberal constitutionalism. In the presentation, I will briefly outline this debate to set the background for the discussion of a very controversial decision by the Bulgarian Constitutional Court in 2018 to declare the so-called Istanbul Convention. This is a Council of Europe Convention on combating gender-based and domestic violence. So our court in 2018 declared this convention anti-constitutional, which basically blocked its ratification by our parliament, but also it blocked its ratification by the European Parliament, as we threatened to impose the veto if this issue is taken up for decision by the parliament. So a brief outline of what I will be talking. I will first very briefly outline the role of constitutional courts in building and consolidating liberal democracy in Central and Eastern Europe. Then I will touch upon the democratic backsliding which our region experienced after the EU accession. And I will point to the path towards illiberalism some of the countries in the regions have taken. Then briefly, I will expand the scope of the discussion by touching on the democratic deconsolidation processes that happened around the world as well, and will stress the role of values and informal practices in this democratic deconsolidation, and particularly in undermining the liberal constitutionalism that is the building block of liberal democracy. Then I will present the debate on so-called illiberal constitutionalism, and will offer a putative definition of this very contested concept. And then at the end, I will present the case study, which is around the controversial decision of our court to declare the Istanbul Convention unconstitutional. I will briefly summarize the rights jurisprudence of our court prior to this decision, and will present a discussion on whether the court should be self-limiting or activist. And actually, to preview my argument, the main take of our court, of a consecutive courts, was to be a self-limiting case. This path of self-limitation was abandoned in 2018 in the decision to declare the Istanbul Convention as anti-constitutional. I will then present the court's reasoning, very controversial, I find it very revealing, and will then at the end present the effects this ruling has had on national and EU level politics. And thanks for Adriana that she mentioned that the research for this presentation and also for the publications on which it is based has been supported by the European Commission, and within a project I'm working currently on, which is devoted to populism and civic engagement. And I'm basically leading a work group that is studying the causes that underlie the rise of populism in Europe, and particularly I focus on the rise of illiberal populism in Central and Eastern Europe. And my talk is based on two papers. One of them is already published, and Adriana mentioned it. The second one is under revision now. It is forthcoming in the Routledge Handbook on Illiberalism. And there I was given the task, very challenging task, to outline the ideology of the nascent illiberalism. And I have provided a discussion on the ideational core of democratic illiberalism. So my talk also is based on this forthcoming presentation. Yes, so I'll start with the role of constitutional courts in consolidating liberal democracy in the region. First, you may know that some of the courts, constitutional courts in the region, were created even prior to the ground zero 1989. For example, the Constitutional Tribunal in Poland was created right after the Solidarność revolution in 81, and it took office already prior to the changes in 89. The Constitutional Court of Hungary was established right after the beginning of the changes, and it was basically negotiated during the roundtable talks that are now being attacked by Orban and Fidesz party as setting a compromise that basically ruined the path towards democracy that Hungary took. But anyhow, Constitutional Court of Hungary was part of the negotiated issues on these round table talks. The same applies for Bulgaria. The court was established in 91, and it was also negotiated at our roundtable talks. The Constitutional Court of the Czech Republic was also created relatively early on in the post-89 history of Czechoslovakia, and after the split of the country, basically both the Czech and the Slovak Republic had their constitutional courts as successors of the pre-war Constitutional Court of Czechoslovakia. And these bulging developments, the mushrooming of constitutional courts, produced an immensely scholarly interest, and especially the role of these constitutional courts for consolidating liberal democracy in the region. Some of you may remember there was a special journal, a very interesting journal, and if you are interested in the history of the constitutional courts and their jurisprudence in the region, you may be interested to consult this journal. It was going out for more than 20 years. It was called East European Constitutional Review, and it was published by the law schools of the University of Chicago and New York University in collaboration with the Central European University. And what emerges from this scholarly interest devoted on the role of constitutional courts is that actually and this is a consensus now in the literature, though there are some dissenting opinions on this, but the consensus seems to be that the constitutional courts played a very significant role in consolidating liberal democracy and in upholding, crucially, rule of law against aggressive majorities. And this was not at all clear whether rule of law will be upheld against such aggressive majorities during the turbulent times of the early transition period in the region. However, though there is a consensus on the constitutional court's role in consolidating liberal democracy, there is much less consensus on what courts should do and how involved in the political process these courts should be. And the dilemma usually is presented as the dilemma between judicial activism on the one hand, and usually the example of an activist court given is the Hungarian Constitutional Court, especially in the 90s. This is the one leg of the dilemma, and the other leg of the dilemma is a self-restraining court. And here we can give an example by the Bulgarian Constitutional Court jurisprudence, and the reasoning of the justices to stick to this self-restraining role in the political process was that given the new constitutional court without an established authority in the political life of the country, the best strategy is to not be too active, to not interfere in the political process by taking a position on controversial issues. So the strategy of our court during several terms of office was self-restraint. I will not need to belabor the point that after the two waves of the accession of the countries in the region, which marked the end of the transition to liberal market democracy, when all the countries in the region that acceded were declared consolidated democracy, and liberal democracy was also declared the only game in town. Almost immediately after this accession, so-called democratic backsliding started, and it accelerated, especially after the economic and financial crisis in 2008. But even prior to this crisis, there was indication of democratic backsliding, and usually it was interpreted as a result of the stiff conditionality of EU accession. And after the countries were admitted, they slowly, some of them slower, others faster, started backsliding. And I should probably draw your attention to a very interesting issue of the Journal of Democracy in 2007 already, which basically treated the issue of democratic backsliding in the region, associating it with rise of populism in the region. And I should draw attention here that the term populism was not at all popular at that time. And if some authors spoke of populism, it was considered an outlandish issue. And if it was taken seriously, it was only taken seriously with regard to some of the countries in the region, the ones that were considered least democratized, with least consolidated democracies. And this rise of populism and democratic backsliding was subject to diverse interpretations. Some of the authors that were contributing to the debate on democratic backsliding limited this phenomenon to Central and Eastern Europe after the accession only. And some argued, I will mention here Philip Schmitter and Ivan Krastev, they at that time argued that this democratic backslide is a temporary backlash against the transition elites that have imposed very heavy transition agenda on suffering publics. So it was understandable that after the period was successfully completed, there might be a backlash against these transition elites that sold a hard pill and painful pill to the publics, but this is going to be a temporary backlash, nothing to be feared in the long run. However, soon authors working on the region were stressing that actually what was expected in the beginning to be just a temporary backlash against a particular brand of transition elites is most likely to turn out into a more permanent crisis of liberal democracy in Central and Eastern Europe because the liberal democracy that was consolidated there was from the start defective. It was a democracy born with a hollow core. And to this hollow core to which Bole and Greshkovits refer to a book they wrote on crisis of democracy in Central and Eastern Europe was due to its imported features, to the fact that democracy was more or less imported without developing the civic activism lack that would enliven this democracy. And there were other arguments by scholars working particularly on Bulgaria, who were saying that the weakness of liberal democracy in the region is specifically a weakness of liberalism there, which is due to subtle cohabitation of illiberal and liberal norms, with the illiberal norms gradually overpowering the former, the liberal norms. And I tend to agree with this diagnosis that actually the weakness is specifically of the liberal values that underlie liberal democracy. They were not strongly developed, and they are not internalized by vast segments of the public in some of the countries in the region to a greater extent than others. But going beyond Central and Eastern Europe, other scholars, most recently in a book authored by the same Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes. Basically, these authors are arguing that liberalism has become a victim of its own success, and the crisis of liberalism is at the core of the crisis of liberal democracy that is spreading not just in Central and Eastern Europe, but is also affecting the so-called mature or consolidated old democracies, not just the young ones from the region. And their diagnosis, and I strongly recommend their book, is that actually the region is suffering from what they term an imitation curse. Liberalism was never established firmly because it was never internalized. The values were never internalized, and understandably, now this imitation that was never fully adopted is producing an outcry, a backlash. Some authors have, however, doubted that what the region is experiencing is democratic backsliding, and also I also already mentioned it is also disputed whether this so-called democratic backsliding is only affecting the region. Some authors prefer to use the term democratic erosion rather than democratic backsliding, and some have argued, the already mentioned Dawson and Hanley in their work on Bulgaria, they have argued that this democratic erosion is exemplified not so much by the region's favorite bad boy, Hungary or Poland, but rather by Bulgaria. And they have depicted the transition and the post-transition trajectory of Bulgaria as a liberal consensus that never was. What was supposed to be the transition agenda, building a strong liberal consensus to buttress liberal democracy, this liberal consensus was illusionary in the first place, and what we are seeing now may in fact be moving towards a kind of equilibrium in which liberal democratic institutions are gradually eroded as the illiberalism of the political mainstream discreetly consolidates. And I would argue that this illiberalism has taken hold not only of the political mainstream as a result of the influence in our government of the coalition of United Patriots. This is a group of coalition of three parties that are part of the current outgoing government of Bulgaria, which is in its last days. But illiberalism has also taken hold of institutions that are considered the pioneers, the most important issues of liberal democracy, such as the Constitutional Court even. I would like to briefly also mention that this crisis of liberalism, this dissolving of the liberal consensus extends beyond the region to well-established so-called old democracies, and it is a symptom of a systemic crisis of democratic deconsolidation. It is not just a defect of young democracies, but the interesting issue is what kind of crisis is this? What are its sources? And I would argue that it is a crisis of constitutionalism, and it is a crisis that is experienced not only in the region, but also beyond. And different scholars have noticed this crisis of constitutionalism in the last 10 years. I will briefly mention a few descriptions or diagnosis of what is wrong with the current state of constitutionalism. Landau, in a very important breaking ground publication from 2013, called this type of constitutionalism abusive constitutionalism, and he characterized it by abusive constitutionalism by the use of mechanisms of constitutional change to erode the democratic order. And we can give examples of such abusive constitutionalism with the new constitution from 2010 that was introduced by the supermajority that Orban's party Fidesz managed to push through in Hungary. Other scholars, Kimle and Chapelier, mostly working again on the example of the Hungarian new constitution and the role of populist nativists that promoted it, termed the crisis of constitutionalism a case of autocratic legalism, and she defines this autocratic legalism as the deployment of law by new autocrats. She means Orban mostly, and this deployment of law by new autocrats is aimed to deliberately attack the basic principles of liberal and democratic constitutionalism in order to consolidate power and to entrench themselves in office for the long haul. And Chapelier basically analyzes both the new constitution, but also the so-called cardinal laws in Hungary, which were changed again using the qualified majority that Fidesz enjoyed for consecutive terms in office in Hungary, in order to strengthen institutions in a way that would serve Fidesz purposes of entrenching their power. For example, some important institutions, independent or quasi-independent institutions, were given longer terms of office. And of course, the idea behind extending the terms of office of this nominally independent bodies was that once their members are appointed by Fidesz, even if electoral success fails Fidesz, still the loyalists that were appointed to these important institutions, be it the central bank, be it the council overseeing the media in Hungary, be it the Supreme Judicial Council, or name it. So the loyalists that were appointed by Fidesz there will support Fidesz even if luck fails Fidesz and they do not manage to hold to power at the next elections. So basically, according to Szepeli, Fidesz and Orban in particular is using legalistic means in order to basically entrench himself in power and turn democracy into autocracy. Other diagnosed the crisis of constitutionalism, terming the crisis a constitutional retrogression, which in fact erodes democracy by more subtle, often imperceptible changes. What we see in the case of Hungary is not imperceptible change. The change is quite significant, but in other countries, the change might be, and the erosion of democracy might be happening in smaller, less conspicuous steps. And authors worrying about the democratic erosion in the region and beyond are warning that these more imperceptible changes might turn out to be more dangerous than the straightforward authoritarian reversion because they go too long unnoticed and there is no resistance to these developments. And this is something that a colleague from the Central European University, legal scholar Renata Uitz, stressed already in 2015. She noted that routine comparative constitutional law analysis is prone to overlook the symptoms of such gradual constitutional decline as incremental decline of competitive election, political rights, and rule of law often happen in two imperceptible ways to be noticed and to provoke resistance. And because they do not provoke resistance, constitutional safeguards are weakened as such changes often happen under the benign guise of institutional compliance. And speaking of institutional compliance, again, we can give an example of Hungary's constitutional crisis, where you have a perfectly legalistic means employed to weaken institutions, which observation brings to the fore a point that has often been overlooked. And this point is that actually for the properly working institutions, what is important is not just their design and their construction, their interrelation, and so on and so forth, but the informal practices and the underlying values that motivate the actors populating these institutions. The purely institutionalist approaches to analyzing democratic decline neglect the role of informal practices and the role of the underlying values, focusing only on the institutional design, on the construction, and whether the construction is well designed and holds or not. However, institutions could be turned into what often is termed empty bottles by aspiring autocrats, and they could be, even liberal democratic institutions could be filled with an entirely different content when the underlying these institutional practices, values are eroded. And stronger emphasis on the role of informal practices and in underlying values in maintaining, undermining liberal democratic regimes could hardly be overestimated. Liberalism and liberal democracy is a value system and is a set of practices. And actually, it is at the level of value system and at the level of practices, including informal practices, that the current problems with liberal democracies could be found. So what we see as a crisis of liberal democracy is rather an erosion of liberal value commitments, which may better explain the dire state of democracies today than just the institutional, than the focus on institutional design. For example, multiple studies, surveys, testify to the erosion of support for minority rights and liberal freedoms at the popular level. I will just quote a relatively recent finding from European Value Survey. In Bulgaria, there is erosion of such support since the beginning of 2000s. Even though then the level of support for such values was not high, now currently it is even further declined. And also there is evidence based on policies implemented by a series of elites in power, that there is less support for rule of law and separation of powers among elites in the region. But this is not only characteristic of the region. There is a clear evidence that there is a global erosion of democratic institutions and values for the last 14 or 15 years. There is a decline in global freedom and democracy as measured by Freedom House. Yet, and this is important to stress, few regimes that experience such decline in global freedom and democracy indexes embrace openly anti-democratic forms of government. Even radical assaults on democratic rule are framed as defense of democratic legality and public promise to hold elections and to restore democracy as soon as possible. This brings me to an important point, that what we experience now as an illiberal decline, as an erosion of liberal institutions, happens within a democratic frame. Democratic regimes decline as a result of formally democratic yet illiberal in substance institutional practices. And I will, because I am short of time, I will not go to the different descriptions of this process that was given in the literature. I will only mention that important scholars define the populism that is strong currently as a form of democratic illiberalism, a regime that is democratic yet anti-pluralist and imposing limits on constitutional checks on popular will. So at the root of the democratic crisis, of democratic erosion, is basically this erosion of liberal values. And this is the source of populism defined as democratic illiberalism. And this brings me to actually the topic of my talk, illiberal constitutionalism. Some scholars believe that illiberal constitutionalism is a conceptual impossibility. This is the position of, for example, the Hungarian legal scholar Gabor Holmai, who is basically stating that the modern constitutionalism, the defining feature of modern constitutionalism is limited government, which is justified by the need to safeguard individual rights. Because populist or illiberal constitutionalism, in his understanding, are authoritarian in nature, they aimed at strengthening power rather than limiting government. They are in fundamental contradiction with the modern understanding of constitutionalism, which is essentially liberal. It aims at safeguarding individual rights and freedoms. So the term illiberal constitutionalism is an oxymoron. Either constitutionalism is liberal or illiberalism cannot have a constitutionalism. I tend to disagree with this position, and I take the position of another legal scholar, Paul Blocher, who in a series of publications devoted to the concept of populist constitutionalism, or what I prefer to call illiberal constitutionalism, has defined as alternative, conservative in nature understanding of constitutional order, which is a reaction to liberal democratic politics. It is a reaction to formalistic liberal institutions, and is a reaction to aggressive institutionalization of a liberal understanding of law in the post-89 transformation in the region, and this understanding of constitutionalism is supported by declarations of important actors in the populist scene in the region. For example, starting shortly after the introduction of the new constitution in 2011, let's say in 2014, in his annual speech to young activists, Fidesz activists, this is a famous speech. Orban boasted that he is building, including through this new constitution, something that he called illiberal state. And his 2010 constitution was intentionally illiberal. And the way he explains what he means by illiberal state is a state which puts the common good before the individual rights. And in later pronouncements, Orban has shifted somewhat from the definition of an illiberal state towards defining the state he's building as Christian democratic state. And this is a project that is shared by Orban with his Polish counterparts, law and justice leader Jarosław Kaczyński, who together with Orban already in 2016 proclaimed that the two leaders of the country aim to turn the European Union into an illiberal project. And this is the purpose of their cultural counter-revolution. I already mentioned that some authors dispute the coherence of the concept illiberal or populist constitutionalism, yet I side with both Blocher and also with Mark Tushnet, an American legal scholar, who speak or admit, based on analysis of different constitutional regimes, of authoritarian even constitutionalism, not only constitutionalism could be illiberal. It could be even authoritarian and still be constitutionalism. So briefly, to end with this discussion, I define illiberal democratic constitutionalism not as authoritarian constitutionalism. It is not full-fledged authoritarianism either. It is rather a more conservative understanding of constitutional order, which promotes stronger communal goods at the expense of individual rights. So constitutional courts on this understanding of illiberal democratic constitutionalism may be instrumental in promoting more conservative substantive understanding of constitutional order, and through a gradual erosion of limited government, the different institutions in the construction of limited government, for example, through the consecutive removal of checks on popular will at the expense of individual rights and freedoms, such courts may also contribute to democratic decay, something that we see on the example of the Bulgarian Constitutional Court's decision to declare the Istanbul Convention unconstitutional. So here I come to my case study, which I will very briefly present. A longer presentation on the same. You can find it, the publication, which is actually, it is posted. You can see it on ResearchGate if you go to my profile there. So I will just briefly go through the case study. It basically tries to elucidate how liberal institutions, such as the Constitutional Court, may be instrumentalized for illiberal substantive purposes under conditions of populist mobilization. This was basically the situation under which the court took its decision. For example, to go back to history, our constitution from 1991 provides a long list of individual rights, including socioeconomic rights, yet interestingly, we don't have recognized minorities or minority rights in our constitution. We don't have individual complaint, no access of ordinary courts to the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court has no explicit mandate to protect individual rights, which is a very interesting setup. However, in order to bolster its legitimacy, the newly established court played it safe, building an image of a cautious interpreter of rights, practicing judicial minimalism, strictly following the text of the Constitution, even on judicial reform. For example, our court ruled in favor of the status quo. Yet, despite these shortcomings, after the EU accession, the court started focusing more on human rights issues, and some have even argued that after the court established itself as a strong guardian of democratic institutions during the difficult years of constitutional transition, time has come to complete the architecture of the comprehensive system of human rights protection by introducing individual constitutional complaint, for example, its last democratic element. This was argued by a prominent constitutional scholar and constitutional justice, Emilia Drumeva, already in 2013. Yet, in its decision from 2018, the court abandoned its judicial minimalism instead of enhancing democratic credential of this institution by introducing individual constitutional complaint, for example. It took an ideologically laden and very activist position in defense of traditional values, which basically forced the court to engage in what could be termed creative jurisprudence. And these developments happened under the rise of illiberal nationalists in Bulgaria, which brought pressure upon rights of unpopular minorities and also individual rights. Two consecutive electoral cycles brought to the public scene a powerful group of national populist parties in 2014. And in 2017, United Patriots managed to score such a support, which basically made them into an attractive coalition partner for the third government of the right-wing party GERB. And the United Patriots, which is a coalition composed of three parties, the VMRO, the successor of the historic Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, VMRO. The second party is Ataka, Volen Siderov's party, which was the strongest populist party maybe in the region, and it was very successful in 2005. And the third party is NFSB, the National Front for Salvation of Bulgaria, of Valery Simonov. So these three parties came together, formed United Patriots Coalition, and then managed to get into government as minor coalition partner of GERB. They were not very successful to push their illiberal legislative agenda. The bills that this coalition proposed, for example, a strategy was what they call gypsy integration, or a law targeting specifically gypsy criminality, or measures to expel foreign NGOs and donors, to stop foreign funding for non-traditional denominations. These initiatives were not successful. They failed to materialize yet. These patriotic, so-called patriotic forces were successful in promoting anti-rights discourse. They were very loud attackers on human rights watchdogs, on NGOs, especially NGOs promoting judicial and green reforms. They were regularly termed Sorosoid traitors, a slur quite common in the region. And these anti-rights discourse are now mainstream and have become part of official discourse. You could hear them, especially in the last parliament, because we just to preview, just a month ago, we had new elections, and neither of the three parties that were part of the United Patriots managed to enter the new parliament, as they ran on separate lists. So they were not successful. And in current parliament, which is very young and it might not survive, most likely it's going to dissolve very soon. But in the new parliament, the patriots are not present, and you don't hear these attacks on human rights, on NGOs. You do not hear the term Sorosoid traitors and so on and so forth. For example, one achievement, a very negative achievement of these patriots, was the blocked start of EU accession talks with the Republic of North Macedonia. This bears mentioning. And all these blocked initiatives basically started a change in the social climate, normalizing attacks against human rights, especially the rights of Roma, migrants, LGBTQ, and this normalizing of attacks against human rights has reached even the highest ranks of the legal profession. There was a case acquitting the deputy prime minister at the time on anti-Roma hate speech. The Supreme Administrative Court in 2019 basically acquitted the leader of NFSB of anti-Roma hate speech. What was the result of the involvement in third GERB government of illiberal nativists? They ultimately managed to block pro-European progressive policies, the Istanbul Convention, the failed ratification of the Istanbul Convention is ultimately their doing. They also managed to block the ratification of the International Pact on Migration. They have blocked the adoption of a strategy on child protection. They have blocked the adoption of the law on social services, the law against domestic violence, and they have also managed to contribute to discrediting Bulgaria internationally, notably by blocking the North Macedonian EU accession talks. Yes, and I already mentioned, they, no matter how big their achievement was, they didn't make it to next parliament because they ran on separate lists. I'm just going through several visualizations of their public presence. Already in 2011, Volen Sidorov and Ataka supporters produced a huge scandal by assaulting Muslims during their Friday prayer in Sofia. What you see here is Valery Simeonov, the future vice prime minister of Bulgaria, who was kicking and pushing Bulgarian citizen of ethnic Turkish origin, who was arriving, a woman, older woman, arriving from Turkey to vote in our elections in 2017. So during a blockade staged by the United Patriots Coalition to stop Bulgarian citizens that live in Turkey to come back and vote in the country, there was this skirmish produced by Simeonov, which did not, and it was broadcast on Bulgarian television, but it did not prevent Valery Simeonov becoming vice prime minister of Bulgaria. Ultimately, Valery Simeonov, after becoming vice prime minister and producing lots of scandals involving human rights issues, he resigned after calling protesting mothers of children with disabilities shrill women who speculate with their supposedly ill children to achieve their purely materialistic goals. This declaration of Valery Simeonov, which costed his vice prime ministerial post, was on occasion of yearly-long protests of mothers of children with disabilities who were protesting against the state not taking enough steps to help them. You see here a Bulgarian member of European Parliament. This is Jambaski, who is speaking on his favorite topic on Tsiganization or gypsization, and the caption here reads that Tsiganization is the road to the dissolution of Bulgaria. And here is the second vice prime minister from the United Patriots, Karakachanov, who comments on the summer 2020 mass protests in Bulgaria, qualifying them as Sorossuit NGOs wanting to usurp power in order to introduce gay marriage. And this person, Karakachanov, the leader of VMRO, is still vice prime minister of Bulgaria, and though in government, outgoing government, caretaker government. Okay, so finally, the failed ratification of the Istanbul Convention by the court in July, at the end of July 2018, the court ruled that Istanbul Convention contradicts Bulgarian constitution. It is a first case of block ratification of an international treaty by our court. It is also the first Council of Europe convention aimed to protect women and other victims of gender-based violence, which is declared unconstitutional by a constitutional court. It is used by populist governments to block, this precedent is used by populist governments to block or even withdraw from the convention. And it also, as I mentioned, blocked the ratification of the convention by the EU. Decision of the court was taken amid public hysteria against the Istanbul Convention and against specifically the gender ideology this convention allegedly promotes. The United Patriots and particularly Vemero Karakachanov were the ones that blew the whistle against the convention, with the main opposition Socialist Party quickly following suit. The president, all major religious denominations, many church-related NGOs also joined in the attack against the ratification. Media contributed enormously: scandal, hyperbolic presentation, and outright propaganda, fanning fears of third sex, of gender ideology, and same-sex marriage dominated the media coverage, which further fueled negative popular reaction. Over 80% of the population, according to polls, were opposing the ratification of the Istanbul Convention. Under this social climate, the government of Gerb withdrew the bill and sent it to the court for preliminary review. And the court came up with a decision which was based characteristically on a flawed and unofficial translation of the Istanbul Convention, which uses just one term, pol, or sex, to cover both concepts, sex and gender, which are distinct in the Istanbul Convention. In this translation, these concepts, sex and gender, were not distinguished. Only once in the text of the translation of the convention, a concept which sparked a huge outcry, social sex, was used in an article on excluded grounds of discrimination. And this use of the concept social sex, or sozialen pol, triggered speculation that the Istanbul Convention introduces third sex along with male and female sexes. The court, in a split decision, 8-4, by the way, characteristically, all 5 women on the court were in support of declaring the convention unconstitutional. So they were sharing the position that it promotes so-called gender ideology. So the court, in a split decision, ruled that the convention is internally incoherent, and this contradiction in the convention creates a second layer in the expression of the judges, in it shifting its meaning beyond its declared, admittedly benign aims. The concept of gender is, of course, the major point of contention. Majority of the justices interpreted this concept not as it is defined in Article 3.6 C as socially constructed, but rather they interpreted this concept as a matter of personal choice. In the words of the majority, gender is the subjective perceptions and notions of the individual and society. It further postulated a close link between gender and gender identity. The second term, note, is used only once in the convention. And further, our justices insisted that gender must be understood entirely in terms of gender identity rather than the other way around, and that the social dimension of gender in the Istanbul Convention is independent from the biological sense of the term. The majority concluded that the distancing from the concept of whole as a biological or of sex as a biological attribute characterizing the division between men and women distances the convention from the declared objectives of defending women against all forms of violence, which was the conclusion they wanted to reach. This view that social roles of sexes are radically detached from biological sex were identified as the gender ideology, which is hidden in the Istanbul Convention as a second hidden layer in the Istanbul Convention. And this gender ideology, even though only hidden, it is undercover, it was found to contradict the Constitution. And it could be argued that the court creatively interpreted the Constitution to uncovering in its text an underlying ideology that, for example, sex is binary and the social roles of the two sexes, and particularly of women, are determined by their biological sex alone. And the final stroke involving the rule of law, the fundamental constitutional principle, basically the judges declare the Constitution, the Convention anti-constitutional based on such speculative interpretations of the two ideologies of the Istanbul Convention's gender ideology, as gender being defined as fully independent from biological sex, and also the constitutional ideology of defining social roles of women as identical with their biological functions. Our court declared the convention unconstitutional as violating the fundamental constitutional provisions on women and their social roles as fundamentally biologically determined. Judges, however, went further than pointing the inconstitutionality of the convention. They also speculated that its internal contradictions due to its distancing from the biological understanding of sexes prevented from achieving its aims of protecting women from all forms of violence. Lastly, engage in constitutional legislation and elevating the principle of sexual binarity to a fundamental principle of human society, not just Bulgarian legal system, they argued that building civil sex or građanski pol on two biological sexes determined at birth is crucial for the legal regulation of civic relationships, marriage, parenthood, and so on and so forth, which require clarity, indisputability, stability, and certainty. This final argument allowed them to bridge interpretation of gender with their master argument that the convention contradicts the constitutional principle of the rule of law in its formal aspect, which requires legal certainty and prohibits to introduce unclearly defined ambiguous concepts such as gender. As the convention would introduce gender and gender identity into Bulgarian legal system, and these are unclear and ambiguous concepts in court's view, this would violate the formal aspects of the rule of law principle, which is the fundament and grounding value of Bulgaria's constitutional order. That was the master argument. They started with a very far-fetched interpretation of gender and gender identity. Then they uncovered a hidden gender ideology in the convention. And at the end, purportedly showed that the gender concept is unclear, and in its introduction in our legal system would undermine a fundamental constitutional principle, that of rule of law in its formal aspect, which requires legal certainty, or predictability. To conclude, the decision from 2018 may define court's character and direction for a whole term and beyond. I should mention here that now a further case on how pole or sex is defined in our constitution is pending in front of the court. And the question was raised by the Bulgarian, the High Court of Cassation. And the court asked whether pole as defined in Bulgarian constitution also includes psychological and social alongside with biological determinants, and whether this definition of pole allows for recognizing transgender people and their right to have their new identity recognized in their legal documents. In contrast to its 1992 decision, which involved the Movement for Rights and Freedom party, the party representing the ethnic Turks in Bulgaria, a decision that basically built an international reputation for our courts because, for example, our constitution, I mentioned this in the beginning, basically does not recognize ethnic minorities, and furthermore, it explicitly prohibits parties to represent ethnic minorities. Nevertheless, in its decision from 92, our court basically ruled that the Movement for Rights and Freedom, the party that mostly represents ethnic Turks, is not unconstitutional. This decision strengthened rights protection and raised the prestige of the country and the court internationally. In contrast to this decision, 2018 decision marks a low point in the court's jurisprudence. It does a disservice to court's central mandate as the human rights guardians. It has also many negative political, legal, and social consequences beyond its immediate effects on gender-based violence and inaction of the country to prevent gender-based violence. It has boosted negative social climate. For example, school programs on gender equality were terminated. Academic projects on gender equality were blocked. Attempts to stop gender study programs, for example, in Sofia University, were luckily were stopped such attempts, but nevertheless they were quite persistent. There is a pressure on courts and on human rights watchdogs, on NGOs and activists to not use concept of gender and not engage in gender equality promotion, which of course subverts efforts to strengthen human rights protection in the country. And instead of countering the negative trend of rights erosion characterizing the recent growth of illiberal national populism, the court had proven one of its central vehicles in Bulgaria, which may undermine court's authority. It undermines definitely court's role as guardian of human rights in a crucial period when fragile liberal democracy is under strong political and ideological pressure from its illiberal critics. So that was my presentation. I'm sorry for, I was afraid that I don't have enough material to speak for an hour. It turned out that, well, I spoke a bit more, but now I would be very glad to get your questions.
Thank you, Ruzha, for this very stimulating discussion and the presentation. I would like to call everyone to join us in the discussion. So either by appearing on the screen or by raising hands or by writing to me or in the chat. I already have a question. So if there's no one else raising hand at the moment, I will read the question from Luka Petrovic. Andrea Križan is also appearing. So should I interpret that as a sign, Andrea? More or less. Okay.
Sorry, I could only come for the last quarter of an hour. So
hi, Andrea. Very glad.
Hi, Ruzha. I haven't seen you for ages.
Yes.
We were classmates many years ago with Ruzha.
Wonderful. Okay, the question is by Luka Petrovic, who asks this. Given the current developments in Hungary, Poland and Bulgaria, what is your opinion on the militant democracy project currently being debated within the EU? How should other countries treat illiberal tendencies in these countries, and where is the line between the sovereignty of the national states and the promotion of common values in the EU?
Thanks for this question. Only last week we had a debate within our consortium working on the Horizon 2020 project on populism and civic engagement around this issue of militant democracy and how and whether it is a good approach to tackling authoritarian or illiberal tendencies in these regimes. And the two positions was that on the one hand, it is understandable that there must be a strong reaction. However, the stronger position and the position I tend to agree with is that an uncautious use of militant democracy instruments might strengthen this illiberal. Basically, it boosts and it confirms the propaganda of illiberals that these liberal, arrogant liberals are trying to remove our sovereignty by imposing limits on our authentically expressed popular will. So any intervention should be really carefully considered and evaluated in order to avoid putting water into the mill of illiberals who are happy to discuss such militant democracy efforts as another sign of liberal arrogance and intervention with sovereign nations. So my take is that it must be really carefully and done with the full knowledge how it is going to be abused.
Thank you. Is there anyone? Andrea, please. Andrea Križan?
I'm here, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry for not being able to I can't turn on my video for some reason, for not being able to listen to the whole thing. I had something else going on. But I'm really interested in the topic, and I actually just submitted a manuscript with a colleague on 4 countries, including Bulgaria, and on these struggles around the Istanbul Convention. So for me, this is
looking forward to reading it.
Yeah, I'm happy to share actually. And I wanna follow up on one sentence that I nevertheless heard from what you were saying. That was the consequences for the field of violence against women and how that is regulated. And I want to push you a little bit on that and tell us. And especially because having known the field of violence against women and how it was regulated in Bulgaria before, it is quite striking how Bulgaria has always avoided to link domestic violence, for instance, to any form of gender inequality or to the notion of gender, but it was always treated as a specific social problem that has nothing to do with any inequality or anything as such. So the whole debate around the convention has shifted amazingly, the discourse around the violence against women from a very neutral discourse to this very gendered thing. And I wonder, what does that mean after the Constitutional Court decision? What do you see? We are how many years? 3 years later, 4 years later, 3 years later. How has that changed? Do we have a different interpretation of violence against women, different policies? Yeah, different position of women's organizations and so on. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for the question. Actually, you're absolutely right that the take of the authorities on violence against women is usually entirely divorced from issues of gender equality. And to support this position, usually here data on gender equality in Bulgaria are quoted, showing that in Bulgaria, and this is one of the very few instances where Bulgaria doesn't score the lowest in Europe. So we don't have problem, or we don't have that much of a problem with gender equality. And here data on percentage of women in managerial posts, percentage of women in the highest income strata, percentage of women in high prestige administrative positions, and so on and so forth are quoted. And on this, Bulgaria is allegedly scoring quite well compared to other countries. And this could be differently interpreted, but this is a favorite line. And domestic violence is only a personal matter. And it is a cultural issue which has very little to do with gender equality. For example, maybe I didn't have time to address, maybe it was too ambitious to present too many things in one, but it is an interesting issue that even our Socialist Party, which is led by a woman, very powerful woman, Cornelia Ninova, was against one particular aspect of the Istanbul Convention, the part where fighting gender stereotypes was concerned. And she basically came up with a definition of our Socialist Party ideology as being socially conservative, social conservatism. Imagine, this is the Socialist Party, which is defining itself as socially conservative party. It is a party that gave the leader of PES, Sergei Stanishev, a member of our Bulgarian Socialist Party, is the leader of PES. But nevertheless, his party is now defined as socially conservative. And even though Bulgaria prides itself as having high achievement in the field of gender equality, nevertheless, it's progressive, allegedly progressive left party is against fighting stereotypes that promote gender inequality. So that's the position of the main opposition party, which is supposed to be the most progressive one and to push gender equality. What to say of the GERB government with its coalition partner United Patriots, who were the ones that blew the whistle against the Istanbul Convention, opposing not only the fighting of gender stereotypes as aligned to our culture and traditions, but also, and most importantly, against the alleged gender ideology in the convention. Interestingly, the whole issue of gender equality is sidestepped. It is not present in public debate. Even women rights organizations do not that much focus on this. Rather, again, taking up and basically agreeing with the official narrative that Bulgaria doesn't have such a big problem with gender inequality. Rather, what we have a problem, even according to our women rights organizations, is problem of violence against women. This is the main problem. And it has very little to do with inequality, gender inequality. So there is no actor that could push this issue in the public agenda. Neither the Socialist Party nor even the NGOs that are the main whistleblowers on important human rights issues are concerned with gender inequality, and they are very happy to quote these surveys showing that we don't have big issue with the gender inequality.
Maybe, Ruzha, what you said about Bulgarian government being sincere with promoting gender stereotypes as part of Bulgarian culture is really what many of people are doing. Many of rather different governments are doing, but they are trying to hide that. So Ivo Gruev had a question.
Hello, I hope you can hear me.
Perfectly.
Okay, that's great. I can't start my camera for some reason, so just deliver the question this way. Okay, now I've got the prompt. Thank you very much. Hello. Thanks to the organizers for hosting this really topical series, and to Dr. Smilova for this very rich in context presentation. As a matter of context, I am doing my PhD on the rights protecting function of the Bulgarian Constitutional Court. And I must say that the scholarship, even in Bulgaria, on this aspect of the Bulgarian court is so incredibly scarce that I was extremely happy to find your article last year on the illiberal turn, and I'm following everything with great fascination that you produce in this regard. So my question is concerns the link between the first and the second part of your presentation, if I can qualify them in this way. So the illiberal turn on the political landscape and the illiberal turn within the Bulgarian Constitutional Court. And my question is about the relationship between correlation and causation between these two events. And I am asking because it's extremely difficult to penetrate the Bulgarian Constitutional Court as an institution and as to the real decision-making processes that are happening there, because it's so secretive, so objectively neutral, so anonymous in a way, so Keynesian, like a proper Keynesian court in a way. So I was wondering, do you have some hypothesis as to where this turn might be coming from? Because they've been keeping a very minimalist line, as you say, a very reticent line, and all of a sudden they go big bang in this area. So can we associate this with maybe a change in the composition of the court? Can we associate it with some kind of political agenda? So how can we connect these two dots as a matter of causation, or is it more of a guessing and just following what's going to happen still?
Yeah. Well, I was also interested in this hypothesis that there was a change in the composition of the court, and given that GERB was in power for the last 11 years, this could account. But actually, no, because you know well that the quotas, 1/3 president, 1/3 parliament, and 1/3 the judiciary, produced and you have different majorities in the judiciary, and you have a different one in parliament. And it was a remarkable unanimity, though the decision is a split one. It's 8-4. But nevertheless, irrespective of who appointed the respective judge, they shared these ideas, quite even conspiracy theories. What they engaged in was conspiracy theory type of interpretation of the Istanbul Convention, under finding an underlying ideology in it. This is nothing original. I'm not saying that this is what is striking, that this conspiracy theory finds its way into an official decision of judges, constitutional court judges, and they were. I mean, textual analysis of their decision is very striking, because there was a very long compilation of opinions supporting or opposing the ratification. And when you read, and it's available online, when you read, you find, without quotations, word by word use of arguments provided by circles opposing the Istanbul Convention there in the court's reasoning, which is striking. How these decisions were made. But you're absolutely right. They're very secretive. They're not open. I know people that have, I should say that I was also very much involved as an activist, trying to publicly support the Istanbul Convention ratification, and I was involved in serious activist actions, including petitions, letters. We drafted a letter that was sent to the court, and some of our members contacted justices to inquire, including the president of the court, to find out what is motivating them. And it was shocking, the level of prejudice and the level of conspiratorial thinking that was basically driving their decision. So is it causality? Is it correlation? I can't say. What I see on the surface is theory of conspiracy, which made its way into the court's decision. And this is a shock. For example, you might be interested to consider a very striking ruling. It's a preliminary ruling of the Constitutional Court on the issue of interpretation of Pope. It was last week. And there, the court refrained from using this conspiratorial thinking. Now it is in purely legalistic terms, all the arguments there, though at the end of the day, they constituted as interested parties, including the Armenian Apostolic Church. Imagine. So we don't know what the decision will be and how they're going to use the reasoning that was given by the constituted parties, whether they will succumb to conspiratorial thinking again, or rather they'll stick to the legalistic arguments. They never discuss, publicly. Even if we have private talks with members of the court, we cannot quote them in. They are not official, so we don't know how they are going to support their reasoning. But it's an exciting case. So take a look at it. When it is out, now it's just a preliminary ruling that they admitted just one of the issues that being asked on the interpretation of Paul in our constitution, which is whether it's only biologically determined or it also allows social and psychological aspects to be included. And it's, yeah, okay.
Thank you. Is there maybe anyone else who would like to interfere in any way? If not, then I had also various questions. I had one question. Thank you, Ivo, too. I had one question about creativity, but I think that we can continue our collaboration on that one, and I would really like to continue this, and especially to also invite you, Ruzha, and everybody else who's here to join us at the beginning of June, when we will have our last presentation and discussion within the series Targeting Anti-Gender Politics, which we will hopefully also continue in the autumn semester. For now, I would really like to thank you, Ruzha, for being with us and for this very inspiring and very thought-provoking presentation of yours. And I think that I really share this notion with all the other participants, which finally gathered at some point during your presentation. It was not such a small number as we were fearing it's going to be, but the whole presentation is going to be online very soon. Thank you again.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for these questions. I mean, I can't really answer them because they are more addressed, I guess, to to our political and class rather. But yeah, that's what I could do in addressing these questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.